It can be hard to grasp exactly what Isaiah is saying in our first reading today. He talks about the desert blooming, the blind seeing, the deaf hearing, the lame leaping, and the mute singing. All these beautiful images, but he also says, "Here is your God. He comes with vindication. With divine recompense, he comes to save you." In a very real way, he's saying that God is coming with vengeance. Normally, when we think of vengeance, we don't think of flowers blooming and people being healed. So why do we see this dissonance? And the question we should ask is, what is the target of God's vengeance? Because the target of God's vengeance here is death itself. God is coming to take vengeance against death. And how will God take vengeance against death? By opening up the Garden of Eden again, bringing life to the lifeless parts of the earth, filling the empty spaces with flowers, and healing the evil present in the world since the fall of man in the garden. Isaiah didn't understand that the vehicle for this vengeance would be Christ's own death on the cross, but he knew that God would restore life. Along those same lines, that is part of the reason why we bring pine trees into our churches and houses at Christmas. Because despite the fact that when we look outside this time of year, everything seems to be dead, we know that God will indeed bring life again. In the short term, with the coming of spring, and in the long term, when he comes in glory to establish a new heaven and a new earth. It is like the farmer that James spoke about in our second reading, who waits patiently, trusting that the earth he has tilled will yield fruit, despite the fact that it looks bare and lifeless for so long. The farmer knows that under the soil, new life is growing. And interestingly, today we hear our first reading from Isaiah quoted in our gospel. And I think it's a neat moment to realize that Isaiah would have seemed more or less as distant to the contemporaries of Jesus as the gospel seems distant to us. Jesus is approached by the disciples of John the Baptist and asked if he is the one they have been waiting for. And I think it's worth taking stock of John the Baptist at this point. St. John the Baptist began his work living an incredibly ascetic life, eating locusts and wild honey, wearing camel hair clothing, living in the wilderness, as he preached that the Messiah was soon to come. He watched his cousin, Jesus, come and be baptized, and he heard the voice from heaven. But then he was arrested. He was held in a Roman prison under the jurisdiction of King Herod, and it is from his imprisonment that John sends his disciples. Now, we don't know John's disposition at this moment. Maybe he was totally confident and sent those disciples to lead them to Jesus. But I like the idea that John might have needed a little reassurance of his own at this moment. After all, John is rotting away in prison, hearing news that his cousin, the Messiah, is performing miracle after miracle. At some point, he might have asked himself, "What exactly am I doing here? Did I do something wrong?" And when his disciples ask Jesus if he is the Messiah, Jesus responds by quoting Isaiah's passage about the coming of the Messiah, a response that John certainly would have understood. And our psalm, in a sense, repeats John's prayer, "Lord, come and save us." John wants to be saved. And we can be pretty sure that this message from Jesus got back to John. But for John, it was more than just a quote that affirmed his belief in Christ as the Messiah. It was a quote that reminded him of two things. First, that God had indeed promised all these good things. And second, John knew Isaiah. He knew that Jesus was indeed beginning to fulfill those prophecies, but often in a way that nobody expected. So in a beautiful expression of faith before the resurrection and even before the cross, John continued to preach against the injustices of Herod and was beheaded for it. John went forward in faith, filled with God's grace, trusting that God would indeed save him, but most likely in a way that nobody expected. And we believe that God did save him. That is why he has the title Saint in front of his name. But this is also relevant for us today. So often we experience our fair share of trials and temptations and can feel the weight of the brokenness of the world pressing down on us, as John must have felt in prison. There's an expression that there are only 3 ways that God responds to us when we ask him something in prayer. Yes, which is easy. Not yet, which is more difficult. Or, no, I have something better planned for you, which can be the most difficult response of all. Today is Gaudete Sunday, and Gaudete means rejoice. We rejoice today despite the crosses of our lives, because we believe that God will save us not from our crosses, but through our crosses. As the entrance antiphon to our Mass today says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. I say again, rejoice. Indeed, the Lord is near."